Imagine it's 2 million years ago. You're an early human living in a small group with your family and friends. Your days are spent scavenging for food, and your nights are spent around a fire keeping warm and telling stories. But there's always a danger of other groups of humans trying to steal your food, or even kill you for fun. So you and your group have to be prepared to fight back. And since you don't have any fancy weapons yet, you use the next best thing, your fists. This is how life was for our early human ancestors until about 300,000 years ago, when we started making weapons. So why were they so violent? Let's talk about that right now. Hi and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to discuss why early humans were so violent. Violence is a part of human nature, but there's been a lot of debate over whether violence is something that we were born with or something that we learned after we evolved from our primate relatives. Now, because we can't go back in time and see what early humans were like, all we can do is try to piece together their behavior by looking at the fossil record, which includes the preserved bones and tools of early humans and their ancestors. For example, one way scientists learn about our ancestors is by studying fossils of their skulls. By looking at the shape of their brain case, scientists can tell if they had a large or small brain relative to their body size. By looking at the shape of their teeth, scientists can tell if they were more ape-like or human-like. And by looking at their jawbones, scientists can tell if they had strong muscles for chewing or weaker ones. And one thing that scientists have noticed is that early hominins, the earliest members of the human family tree, had really strong neck muscles and backs of their heads. This suggests that they could support themselves while standing upright. This also means that they had strong muscles in their shoulders and upper backs, which would have helped them climb trees. Scientists think this is an important adaptation because climbing trees would have helped our ancestors escape predators like big cats and hyenas. Another thing scientists have noticed is that early hominins had really strong jaw muscles. This suggests that they had a strong bite force, which would have helped them cut through meat while eating. But it doesn't necessarily suggest that they hunted animals for food. That's because the strongest biting animals today aren't carnivores. It's herbivores like cows and horses. This is because plants can be tough and fibrous, so they require strong jaws and teeth to chew through. So it seems like early hominins were perfectly suited for climbing trees and chewing through tough plants. But what does this tell us about how they acted? Well, climbing trees and chewing through tough plants requires lots of strength. This suggests that early hominins were probably strong too, and scientists think that being strong both physically and mentally is a key factor in understanding early human violence. Early humans didn't just need to be strong for survival, they needed to be smarter than other animals to survive. They needed to outsmart predators and find new ways to get food and shelter. All these things required intelligence, and although we don't know exactly how intelligent early humans were, scientists think they were probably smarter than other apes, otherwise they wouldn't have survived. Scientists also think that having large brains may have played a role in early human violence. Large brains require lots of energy to run, so humans who lived 2 million years ago probably had to eat more calories than other primates to meet their energy needs. And calories mean food, and getting food often means conflict. If early humans had to compete with each other to eat, it makes sense that they would sometimes turn violent. But another factor to consider is the environment they lived in. The world 2 million years ago looked very different than it does today. Most of the world was covered in forests, not deserts and grasslands. But there was one place where early humans thrived, the savannah. There were few trees, tall grasses, lots of open space and plenty of food like wild fruit, tubers and grazing animals. Scientists think that because the savannah was such an ideal place to live, many early human groups moved there, which increased competition for resources and therefore increased violence. Some anthropologists, however, argue that early humans didn't become violent because they moved to the savannah, but rather that moving to the savannah made them less violent. Their reasoning is that living in a forest requires lots of cooperation because it's hard to see predators coming. Living in groups meant that early humans could watch each other's backs and help each other escape from danger. On the other hand, living on the savannah meant that early humans didn't need to cooperate as much. They could see predators coming from far away, so they didn't need to rely on others for help. This may have led to more independent hunting, which may have reduced the need for cooperation and therefore reduced violence. So it seems like violence may have been a part of life for our ancestors, whether they lived in the forest or on the savannah. But what about the development of weapons? Humans are the only species on Earth that uses tools to hunt and fight other humans. So how did this behavior evolve? One idea is that weapons made early humans safer and therefore lessens violence. Here's why. Imagine you're a man living 200,000 years ago. You want to attract a mate, so you decide to show off your strength by fighting another man. After all, what's more attractive than a strong warrior? But instead of fighting with your fists, you grab a spear. Now the fight is safer and more effective. Spears allow fighters to keep a distance from each other, meaning they're less likely to get injured. This could reduce the overall amount of violence because the risk of injury is lower. But despite this, weapons may have also increased violence. Here's why. Imagine you're a member of a tribe and you're fighting another tribe over land. In this scenario, the two sides might start taking more risks. For example, one side might be willing to sacrifice more of its members in order to defeat the other side. This is called the disposable population. The more disposable people a group has, the more willing they may be to take risks. If a group has lots of young men who haven't yet reproduced, they can afford to lose some in battle without reducing the number of people in the next generation. So the more young men a group has, the more willing they may be to fight and die in battle. Another factor that might lead to more violence is the availability of resources. Groups with access to more food and fewer members are more likely to be able to defend their territory because they have more energy available to use, and because they have fewer members, they have more access to resources in their territory. So groups with access to more food and fewer members may be more willing to defend their territory, leading to more violence. So although it might seem like the development of weapons made early humans safer, they may have actually made them more violent, especially because of the disposable population and the availability of resources. So now we have an idea of why early humans were so violent, because of strong muscles, competition for resources, large brains, and the development of weapons. But one thing we still haven't answered is this nature or nurture? Is violence something that we were born with or something that we learned? Now, if you ask most people, they will say that violence is something that we learned. But research suggests that violence may actually be both nature and nurture. In other words, both our genes and our environment play a role in how violent we are. Research shows that genes can influence how aggressive we are, but our upbringing can change how aggressive we act. This means that violence is something that we're born with, but we can change it. Today, we don't see the same level of violence among humans that we did 2 million years ago. Maybe this is because humans today have developed laws and social norms that discourage violence, or maybe it's because we live in a modern society with more access to food and fewer predators. Whatever the reason, it's clear that humans today are less violent than our ancestors were 2 million years ago. So what do you think? Why were early humans so violent? Do you think it had something to do with their environment, or do you think it's something that we were just born with? We humans love to think of ourselves as special, unique, one of a kind in this universe. And sure, we have achieved some pretty impressive things, built cities, cured diseases, created an app that lets us talk to each other from across the world. But all those things are relatively recent developments in our species' history. They don't really tell the whole story of what makes us us. To really understand how we became who we are, we have to look back even further, back to the prehistoric era when our distant ancestors were just trying to survive. What kind of world did they live in? And how did that environment shape them? Well, if you ask me, it was a violent world, so violent that it's arguably the single most important factor in our evolution. Let me explain. I also want to be clear that this video is not going to answer the question of how humans evolved. That's a big question, and it's a complicated one. And there isn't any one thing that scientists agree on. Like we all know about natural selection, right? Survival of the fittest. Well, there's actually debate about whether or not it was the most important factor in our evolution. Other theories suggest that maybe group selection, aka living in groups, was just as crucial. Okay, so what I want to focus on today is violence and its role in our development. In particular, I want to look at two theories about our evolution. The first is called the savannah theory. It says that we became human because we left the forest and moved on to the open grasslands. The second is called the aquatic ape hypothesis. It says that we became human because we went from land to water. The savannah theory, by the way, is widely accepted among paleoanthropologists, but the aquatic ape hypothesis, not so much. Still, I think both theories have their merits, and they raise some fascinating questions about the nature of humanity. For example, the theory goes that our ancestors were basically apes that lived in the forests of Africa. They were probably quadrupedal, walked on all fours, had long arms, big brains. You know, classic ape stuff. At some point, though, they decided to leave the trees and move on to the savannah. Maybe it was because the climate was changing and the savannah was more hospitable than the forest. Or maybe they just got sick of eating bugs and decided to try something new. Whatever the reason, once they got out there, they quickly faced a problem. See, the savannah was full of predators like hyenas and lions, and our ancestors weren't built for running. For most of us, I mean, the thought of having to outrun a lion is terrifying, but for these early humans, it was literally life or death. So to survive, they had to adapt. The savannah theory says they stood up on two legs so they could run faster, leaving their hands free to use tools. Over time, they developed bigger brains so they could plan ahead and outsmart their prey. They also developed larger social groups so they could protect each other from predators. In short, the savannah forced them to become human. Now, there's a lot of evidence to support this theory. For one, the fossil record shows that the earliest members of our genus, Australopithecus, were bipeds. They walked upright on two legs, and that happened before they had big brains or really any other distinctly human features. Second, we know that our ancestors started using stone tools about 2.6 million years ago, which suggests that they were already thinking about the world in a more complex way. Finally, the archaeological record shows that our ancestors lived in groups sometimes numbering in the hundreds, which would have made them more visible to predators, but would have also given them more opportunities to work together and defend each other. So far, so good. But let's say you're not convinced, you think there's more to being human than just being good at running. Well then, let me tell you about the aquatic ape hypothesis. In 1960, a British zoologist named Sir Alister Hardy came up with a radical idea. He thought that the real reason we became human wasn't because we moved to the savannah, it was because we moved to the water. Hardy noticed that humans seemed to be kind of a hybrid species, part ape, part fish. We have ape-like hands and feet, but our heads and hips are more like fish. Our skin is smooth like fish, we sweat like primates, we can walk on two legs like apes, but we can also swim underwater like fish. And then there's the whole upright walking thing, which Hardy saw as evidence that we spent a significant amount of time in the water. After all, most mammals that walk upright do so while swimming. Now obviously people didn't take Hardy's theory very seriously. How could they? He basically suggested that humans evolved from fish. But Hardy wasn't done. He continued to collect evidence for his theory. And over time he found more and more similarities between humans and fish. For example, humans and fish have the same type of middle ear, which is different from the middle ear bones found in other mammals. We also have a similar structure in our eyes and a similar system for balancing ourselves. Even our brains have a lot more in common with fish brains than you might expect. And according to Hardy, it all comes down to vision. You see, our eyes are adapted to see both above and below the water. Fish can see well underwater, but they have trouble seeing in the air. Mammals, on the other hand, can see well in the air, but they can't see very well underwater. Humans, however, are perfectly adapted to see both places, which means that our ancestors probably spent a lot of time in the water. Hardy thought that our ancestors were basically amphibious creatures that lived along riverbanks and ate a diet of fish. This is also when he theorized that they developed their opposable thumbs, which would have come in handy for catching slippery fish. As the story goes, they spent several 100,000 years living this lifestyle until a catastrophic flood forced them to leave the water and move to the mountains. There, they evolved into modern humans. Now, Hardy's theory has its problems. Like, there's no fossil evidence to support it. Plus, he never really explained where all the fish went or why the flood happened. Still, it raises some fascinating questions about the origins of humanity. For example, the fossil record shows that modern humans only emerged in Africa about 300,000 years ago. But the archaeological record shows that stone tools have been around for at least 2.6 million years. So where did the technology come from? If Hardy is right, maybe it came from the fish. Maybe our fishy ancestors were already using tools to catch fish, and those tools eventually made their way to land. But either way, I think Hardy was onto something. He was onto something big. Violence, I mean, think about it. When you live in a violent world, you have to adapt or die. That's true whether you're a gazelle or a hyena, a human or a fish, and we have evidence of this all around us. Like our closest relatives, the chimpanzee, have developed huge brains and complex social structures because they live in large groups and compete for food. Meanwhile, smaller primates with fewer predators don't need such big brains, they can get by with less. As for humans, our brain size increased significantly after we left the forest and moved to the savannah, which was much more dangerous than the forest. And our ancestors weren't the only ones who got bigger brains. Hyenas and lions also got bigger brains, although they started out smaller than ours. Another example is our skeletons. They show evidence of trauma, puncture wounds, broken bones, which suggests that our ancestors were constantly getting injured, probably because they were always on the run from predators. Or take our hands, which have become much more dexterous over the past few million years. Some paleoanthropologists believe that this is because we started using tools, but I think it's because we needed nimble hands to climb trees to escape predators. And then there's our social behavior. We tend to think of humans as highly social creatures, and that's true. We live in groups, form alliances, make friends, fall in love. But our primate relatives are just as social as we are, sometimes even more so. Chimpanzees, for example, live in groups of up to 150 individuals. They have complex social structures and engage in politics. So what makes humans different? Well, I would argue that it's the way we deal with conflict. Humans are unique in their ability to negotiate, to find compromises and make deals. And that's because we have big brains. We're smart enough to realize that fighting isn't always the best solution. Of course, we still fight. We go to war, commit acts of terrorism, blow each other up. But we also have the capacity to do better. We can choose peace. So that's my theory of human evolution. I call it the violence theory. I think that everything that makes us human, our big brains, our dexterous hands, our complex social structures, it's all a direct response to living in a violent world. Now, I'm not saying that violence is a good thing, it's not, it's terrible. But I think it's important to remember that we're all products of our environment. The world our ancestors lived in was violent, and we wouldn't be here today if they hadn't adapted to it. So next time you feel like we're doomed because of our violence, just remember that it's also what made us human. Thanks for watching.